Hey, all my IFG friends, this is Steve. I want to say, if you like movies like I do, we've started a new podcast called Happy Hour Flicks. You can find it anywhere podcasts are found. It's all about nostalgic movies that we love, and we bring on special guests each episode, and we also have specialty cocktails made for each one, too. So it really is an hour of a good time talking about movies that we love, like Gremlins, Seven, Free Willy. We talk about The Last Starfighter also. I mean, we kind of run the gamut across all the decades and really have a great time. So wanted to invite you to come over and join us. That's Happy Hour Flicks, anywhere podcasts are found.
Hey, Stephen Pierce. What's up, man?
Matthew Mundus. What is going on, sir?
Hey, just excited for this episode. We've got Michael Gingold today, which is great.
Michael Gingold, great guest, knows everybody and everything in the horror community, I would say is a pretty safe way to describe him.
Yes, with just decades of knowledge and firsthand experience of so many things in the horror genre release and the visuals and the impact. It's a great discussion we have.
He's a screenwriter, an author, a journalist. I'd say, we talk about this quite a bit, but journalism is really probably his primary focus. But he has this, he has a lot of vast knowledge about the whole industry and everything surrounding it.
Yeah, he's got a great, unique vantage point, and it's just so, it comes so easy. It's amazing.
After talking to him, and obviously we're recording this after having spoken to Michael.
Yes.
I don't have good name
spoilers.
I don't have good name recognition. You know what I mean? Like, I don't remember names very well. It's hard for me to recall.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I've always just been that way. He can just at the drop of a hat be like, from 1976, this horror film with this person starring in it who also starred in this and this and this. And it's just amazing to me that people can do that.
It is pretty insane, and I love it. And we do get into a lot of the horror literacy and just and recall and the history of it, which is great too, because he talks about how important that is, and just knowing those things, and he has them at his fingertips, which gives him all the more. It's all the more exciting to talk with him about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can tell he loves it so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the
Independent
Filmmakers Guide
from Framework Productions.
Framework
Productions.
Hello and welcome into another episode of the Independent Filmmakers Guide. And I'm Matt Mundy, your co-host with Stephen Pierce. And today we have Mike Gingold, journalist, screenwriter, director, horror aficionado. I mean, guy has all the hyphens. And honestly, there isn't a better guest to talk to about the development, changes, and outlooks for all things in the horror industry. So, Mike, it is good to have you with us.
Great to have you, Mike.
Thanks for being here, man.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And I mean, with that in mind, we are right here at the Tribeca Film Festival. So what are some things you're excited about coming up?
Hang on one sec. Sorry.
Sure.
No problem. This happens all the time, unfortunately. We get important people on, and then they have important things happen to them because
it's just
Exactly.
As usual. I forgot to turn the ringer off on the cell phone. Sorry
it's okay, Mike. You can totally throw us under the bus. We are the least important thing happening today to you.
I blame your assistant.
Yes, my assistant failed to turn off my cell phone. So
Nice.
or to mute it anyway. Sorry about that.
Not at all.
So we were talking about Tribeca. Yeah, there's a few things that I'm pretty excited about. One is a movie called One Night with Adela, because there's a really great Spanish kind of very dark drama / horror film called Piggy from last year. And the star of that film, Laura Galan, stars in One Night with Adela, and it's a revenge movie. So just the idea of this actress in another revenge film is really, really promising. So I'm really looking forward to that. Suitable Flesh, which is Joe Lynch, Barbara Crampton, a screenplay by Dennis Paoli based on Lovecraft. You can't go wrong with that.
No.
There's quite a few, but those two are kind of like, and then outside of the genre, I'm really excited about Enter the Clones of Bruce, which is David Gregory's documentary on Bruceploitation and all the movies that came out trying to ride on Bruce Lee's coattails, which I'm really looking forward to also. It's going to be a packed weekend. There's like 4 or 5 really great kind of midnight and other genre films. And one that I've already seen, which I really liked, which is in the narrative competition, called Somewhere Quiet, which is kind of a very dark drama about a woman who is kind of a final girl. She survived a horrible experience, and it's kind of about the aftermath of that and what happens when she's trying to put her life back together, and her husband and another person are making it very difficult for her to do so. So it's kind of horror adjacent, but that's a really good one that I've already seen. So there's a lot of good stuff in Tribeca this year.
Dude, yes, there is. This is the one where she goes to like her husband's family compound, right?
Yeah, they go off to a, it's actually, it's interesting because the setup is like a horror film. They go to a house in the woods, and weird things happen, but in this case the horror is allegedly behind her and now she's recovering, but she hasn't quite gotten away from it at this point. And it's sort of the basic premise is what happens to the final girl after she has gotten away. So it's a really interesting kind of place to start a very dark, sort of vaguely horrific drama. Really well acted. Marin Ireland, who is in Dark and the Wicked and The Boogeyman and The Empty Man, is in this, playing a very different role than she usually does, and she's great in it. She's not the lead; she's a supporting player, but Jennifer Kim, who's the lead, is also terrific. And so that one I can already recommend.
Now, Michael, I've got to ask you, I mean, since the 80s, I mean, you've been in the film space and you've had so many things involved in the horror space specifically. Do you watch anything besides horror movies? Because how the hell do you find time to watch all this, memorize all these stats and all these names for all these people? I mean, do you once in a while just show up to the theater and be like, today's a rom-com. I've got to just kind of cleanse the palate a little bit.
Oh, I watch all kinds of movies. In fact, when I was writing for Birth Movies Death, when they were still going, my second thing I specialized in was animated musicals.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
I mean, I love the animated films. I love the Pixar stuff. I love all that kind of thing. So I would review those on a regular basis. So I really do see all kinds of movies. The thing I don't get to look at as much is TV and streaming series. There are always these series that everyone is talking about, Yellow Jackets and Succession, and the only one I've really had time to look at is Stranger Things. But I watch so many movies, and there's so many kind of smaller horror films that kind of come out independently and on streaming services and at festivals, etc. And it really kind of keeps you from investigating the series as much as I'd like to. So while I do keep up with all kinds of movies, there's a lot of TV and streaming that I wish I could catch up with that I just don't have the time for.
No, that makes sense. Well, so how much of Stranger Things did you get into?
I've seen all of the first 3 seasons, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through the 4th one. So I love it. I think it's a great show. I'm a Winona Ryder fan from way back, so that was one of the first things that got me watching it. And it's become kind of a trendsetter too, in a sense.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, more like I'd love, and without you being done with it, I don't want it to be an unfair question, but I'd love, with your vantage point, how you see this indeed being a trendsetter, and also what it's doing well with its homages. If as far as like your experience, and of course you can't go wrong when you have Winona Ryder in the middle of it.
Well,
so.
I mean, and like Stranger Things was like it was like a cult, like, I don't know, like what am I trying to say? Like a societal breakthrough, right? Like it was just such a thing, like the whole urban legend of it. And now you have like series like Wednesday, and it feels like horror is really starting to get a lot more presence in sort of the longer form series format from the streamers. Which, I mean,
Mike Flanagan is a big one,
right? I mean, obviously.
I've been a fan of Mike Flanagan's from his very first film, Absentia, which was a very small film, which I just loved. And it's been really exciting to kind of, I mean, that's the kind of thing, the exciting thing about being at this as long as I have, is seeing a very small film that I really like, and then watching the filmmakers kind of ascend to greater prominence. I think the best example is Guillermo del Toro. I can still remember seeing Kronos for the first time, which was this little film emerging from Mexico. And then all these years later, I mean, he's, the major guy in the field at this point. So I'm so looking forward to his Frankenstein, and I'm so excited he's finally getting to do it.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. And yeah, Guillermo del Toro is exactly that example. And Kronos, come on, that is so good.
Well, I suppose you have, I was gonna say you have, like, I mean, Guillermo del Toro is a great example of what I think you have a really interesting insight into, because you've been so deeply involved in this process. on many different aspects for years. Like, do you think that there's the same process available to other newer filmmakers that where Guillermo del Toro, I mean, is a absolute fucking legend. Like, you know what I mean? He's like top, I mean, not only of like all filmmakers, especially in the genre space. That's probably one of the first names people come up with. So do you think that the industry is modeled in a similar way now, and that the same thing could happen again?
I think, Mike Flanagan is another good example, a guy who made a small film. And I think sometimes it can happen instantaneously. I mean, you look at Jordan Vogt Roberts. I can't remember the name. He did a small independent film, and then the next thing you know, he's directing Kong Skull Island. And I think that there is a certain amount of a sense of discovery among the studios as they want to grab like the hot indie filmmaker and jump them right into their first huge movie. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But what's exciting is that there are so many more showcases for small independent genre films now. There's Tribeca and there's 100 other festivals where these films can kind of emerge and people can get seen and get into the Hollywood system. And at the same time, there are some who prefer to stay independent and don't trust the Hollywood system, for good reason sometimes, I think. But there's a lot more opportunities. There's streaming. There's so many places like Mike Flanagan. He did some wide release movies. He did Doctor Sleep, which to my mind is an excellent film that didn't get a fair shake at the box office. But he's in the streaming space now where his stuff can really get the kind of attention that maybe Doctor Sleep didn't get at the box office.
Right. That's a really good point, because it was like, coming into Doctor Sleep, he had already had a little bit of the streaming success, and then was like, okay, I'm going to do something more theatrically, and you're right. I think he didn't get the fair shake that way.
I mean, what is your experience? How do you feel like horror does in, theatrical space? It feels like you either see, you only see these kind of massive wide release films in horror, right? But horror is so many, like there's so many other great films out there that don't ever have that. How do you find, I mean, do you see any similarity or success, or what is your experience with the theatrical run of a horror film?
Well, it's cool that this year and in the last few years, there've been, with Blumhouse, but also other films, there's been these kind of smaller scale movies that studios have picked up and given wide releases to. You've just had a string. I think Smile is probably the best example of a film.
Sure.
It was made on a low budget. They were going to send it, out streaming. And then the test screenings were so good, they put it in theaters and it wound up grossing over $100 million.
Yeah, what was the original title of that? They had like, it was something.
Oh, yes. Something.
Oh,
it was,
yeah. Like Someone Can't Sleep or so. I wish I knew it exactly, but yeah,
it was something very different.
Yeah. I want to say it was something about Mary.
Yeah, there you go. That's a hilarious thing about like title, because that is a perfect title for that movie. I mean, if you've seen that film, like it just nails it on the head. But sometimes it takes so long to just find that simplicity, and it's an insane thing to say if you're not a filmmaker or a creative person. But like when you finally hit it, you feel sort of like a dumbass that's like, it's been here the whole time. And I had this weird like 2-sentence title with a colon in the middle of it, and the best title was Smile or something similar. I don't.
Well, they also hooked a great marketing campaign to it where they sent like people to baseball games to just stand behind people with these evil grins on their faces. It's such an easy way to promote a horror film, and they really pulled it off. And The Boogeyman was also going to go straight to streaming. They decided to send that theatrically. There's been a few cases like that, and it's pretty healthy. Whether you like these individual films or not, it is very healthy that, or something like Megan, which was intended to be kind of a small, it was going to be a nationwide release, but it wasn't going to be a major thing. And then that first trailer just went viral because of the Megan dance, and it wound up grossing $90 million. So
it's crazy. That's
the Black Phone last year was a big success. Barbarian, I don't know if that was going to go to streaming or not, but it was going to be a very small release that just kind of came out in early September, and then it got this heat behind it and it grossed 40 million. So
I was going to ask you if you knew about Barbarian's like initial marketing plan. I think that for me, that film is the most unique of the last couple of years of horror films that I've seen. I think that one it broke the format in so many ways, and it was so fun.
Yeah, it's a great movie to see with an audience. And
yes,
yeah, I mean, I think the expectation was it would open to 5 million for the first week and then go away and do its business on streaming. but it got this, somehow it got a word of mouth behind it without having a lot of advanced screenings. I think, the reviews were very positive and more people started getting interested, and it did far better than I think anyone expected. And legitimately so. I saw it without a whole lot of expectations. When I first saw the promotion, I was like, well, okay, because they didn't show in the trailer anything past like the first 20 minutes, which looked kind of generic. And then you go to see it and you see that that's all in the first act, and then Justin Long shows up and you're like, wait, what does this have to do with what we've been watching? And the way it all ties it all together is so clever and smart, and really also it gets into some scary, disturbing, perverse kinds of areas. So it was great to see the marketplace support a movie that was that kind of experimental and weird, and that it kind of broke the formula a little bit as far as commercial horror is concerned.
100%. As as a writer, I love it when films are like different and they break the mold and it works, because so often people do and it doesn't fully work. Like, it can work to a certain degree, but I think they're introducing Justin Long in like 30 minutes or something, and the whole time you think it's going to be Skarsgård as the bad guy, which I was like, they just did it so well.
That's the expectation from the trailer and even for the opening. Well, this is Pennywise, so of course, he's going to be the sinister one plotting to entrap this girl, and then it turns out something entirely different is happening. So yeah,
and
I thought that was just great.
And they did to Airbnb what the movie with, oh god, I can't remember, Sarah Jessica Parker, like Sex and the City did to Peloton, and just like just like kill a stock, you know what I mean?
And the funny thing is, this didn't even occur to me, but I'm told the reason it's called Barbarian is that Barbarian is an expanded anagram for Airbnb.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Oh,
yeah.
I did not.
Oh,
know
that's
that.
amazing.
Yeah, it took me a while to even notice that, but someone pointed that out, and it's like, now it makes a certain, because it also has to do with the whole toxic masculinity thing that's in the,
sure.
But it's also, you scramble Airbnb and expand it a bit, you get Barbarian. So
it also does like that fun thing, and not that this is supposed to be just a love story to Barbarian, but I mean, what the hell, we're here. But the whole opening, like, again, I was like, who the hell would stay in this Airbnb? I was like, I would sleep in my car in a Walmart parking lot before I go into an Airbnb with somebody I don't know. I give so much stress when I go to an Airbnb and I have to meet the host, just to get the keys. I'm like, oh my God, this is the most stressful part. Please just give me the key and run. Give me the key and run. I don't want to see other humans.
Well, I've had a couple of weird Airbnb experiences myself. Nothing nearly that weird, but every so often odd stuff has happened. So it was inevitable that there'd be an Airbnb horror film, and it's great that the first one was so good.
Oh my, yeah, yes. And I guess it makes me think, we've been talking about a lot of the releases that are so creative recently, and I remember, so like, in the 90s or in the 80s, were so many horror films being released theatrically, and just one on top of the other. And then VHS comes along, and then it's like there's this decline of theatrical releases, and then from in the 90s, and then so you see all this creativity that builds up in the 2000s, and then streamers come, which kind of has the same effect. And then there's this like another renaissance of creativity in this era. Is that kind of what you're seeing, like that little ebb and flow, and a challenge comes in for theatrical release so people can watch horror movies together, and somehow the industry's like, no, horror is a communal thing, we have to watch this together?
Well, it's funny. I first started at Fangoria in the late 80s. I joined the staff in 1990, and that was right at the time where you were really seeing the rise of VHS. You had the decline of the slasher genre, which to a lot of people defined horror. There were still people through the 90s for whom slasher and horror were interchangeable.
Right.
And all these factors that led to this huge decline in theatrical releases. And, for a number of months, we would kind of struggle to fill up an issue because there just weren't a lot of horror films out to cover, which was cool because it did allow me to every so often do interviews with really interesting below the line people who were not major filmmakers, but like Spiro Rosatos, for example, who did all the stunt coordination on Bill Lustig's movies, and Kyle Cooper, who did the titles for Seven, which were an incredible trendsetter. But, and it was because there were just not a lot of movies coming out. And then Scream came along in 96, and then you had The Sixth Sense and the Blair Witch Project in 1999. And those just kind of kicked the doors open, and horror has been kind of a box office force ever since. And then by the time I think you get to the late 90s, you start to get filmmakers and maybe even a few studio executives who grew up on the movies of the 70s and 80s and loved them and were very interested in kind of recapturing all that. Then you get all these remakes of every film that was big in the 70s, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and, Halloween and The Fog and When a Stranger Calls and The Hitcher. Even the movies from the 80s that were not hits like The Hitcher but were cult favorites were getting remade.
Right.
And I think now we're at the point where horror is no longer looked down upon and is and again, the movies that are making money in the last couple of years are the big, huge, expensive tent poles and relatively inexpensive horror films. And those seem to be the two that are kind of guaranteed box office almost more than any other kind. As an overall movie fan, I wish there were all kinds of movies making money, but as a horror fan, it is nice that horror is not only accepted as a box office genre, but it doesn't have to be watered down necessarily to do well. You have, there are still the ones that they kind of soften them for a PG-13. I know Megan was trimmed a little bit to get that PG-13. I think it was that one. But you also have Barbarian, which is a hard R and came out and was successful. So it's nice that there seems to be room for all that kind of stuff. But I also want to emphasize that there are also a lot of really good smaller horror films that I don't think are necessarily getting the exposure they should. There are a lot of the little ones that they come out in a handful of theaters and then they go to streaming, and they kind of have to fight to be noticed because there's so many of them. Like there are 2 or 3 independent horror films every week coming out on streaming, it seems like, and it can be kind of hard to separate the good from the bad sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, taking a step back here so Mike, you went to film school at NYU, right? In 1985?
Yes, in the late 80s. Mm-hmm.
So what was your transition in your journey from being because you're also a screenwriter and you do all kinds of stuff, but it seems like your real focus for most of your career has really been on the journalism aspects of it. How did that all come about?
Well, I started doing a Xerox fanzine when I was a teenager, and Fangoria was based in New York, so it was always kind of an ambition of mine to get into. I'd see Bob Martin at the conventions when I was 15 and pitch him as a writer, and of course he's like, yeah, kid, sure. But then when I was at NYU, I went in to interview for an internship at Fango, and Tony was aware of my writing in the fanzine, and they offered me an article instead. And the rest is history. So, I do have some screenwriting credits, some of which I'll admit to, others of which I'd rather not discuss. But journalism really seemed to be the niche that I found that I could really thrive in. And then in the last several years, I've started doing featurettes for various Blu-rays and documentaries, one feature length, a number of half feature length ones, and then my favorite thing is the location things where I go to the location of a horror film and I show what it looks like now as compared to what it looked like in the film. And so it's a great way to kind of do both. It's kind of a journalistic thing, but it's also a filmmaking process. So
yeah, and it fits your enthusiasm as a straight up enthusiast.
Yeah, it's a nice balance. It allows me to scratch the filmmaking itch while I'm still doing all of the journalistic stuff that I do.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know an early one you did was what was it? Lost Soul.
Oh, that was just me being a talking head in a documentary.
You were being interviewed. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I was gonna say, yeah. So I was gonna just use that as first of all, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
That was just. I had firsthand experience with the whole Dr. Moreau thing. I talked quite a bit in that, which didn't wind up in the doc, about Fangoria used to do specialized magazines tied into individual movies. Right. And we did a whole bunch of like Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy magazines with New Line. And then they came to us with Island of Dr. Moreau. And that was such a troubled production that the micromanaging on that magazine was absolutely ridiculous. And one of the things I used to do for those was the story in pictures, where I would kind of break down the script. We would run like 30 sequential photos from the movie, and I would write a caption for each one, just kind of telling the story. And so they sent me the production draft of the Moreau screenplay, and I looked at this thing and I'm like, I can't make heads or tails out of this. I don't know what story is being told here.
It's like throw a dart for a still image.
Yeah, it was like 30 different revisions and nothing made sense. And we eventually passed it on to another writer who was able to come up with a coherent synopsis based on this. But yeah, that was an interesting process doing that whole magazine. And so yeah, Moreau was kind of an interesting experience, at Fangoria working on this tie-in magazine, which, allowed us to be privy very early on to all the problems that this movie was having.
When did you
And we,
join? When did you join Fangoria?
sorry?
When did you join Fangoria?
Well, I wrote my first article for them in 1988 while I was still in college.
Oh my
and then
God!
I
So you
staff
were
in 1990.
Yeah, you were really there,
Right.
and what I would consider, for at least it was me and my generation, the '90s, that heyday of Fangoria.
Well, the really big period was in the mid to late 80s
Mm.
because Freddy Krueger was like our cover boy. Like
Mhm.
anytime Freddy was on the cover of an issue, sales would go through the roof.
Oh
And there
yeah.
were other competing magazines that would come out because anything with Freddy on the cover would sell. And right around the time I joined in 1990 was around the time that was starting to wane. We got Freddy's Dead, the alleged final nightmare.
Right.
But then later on, you got Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I think is a great movie and kind of pointed Wes Craven towards Scream and the whole horror renaissance that started. But yeah, Fango had some of its first heyday in the 80s, but then I think late 90s, more like in the 2000s when horror started to become big, was when you started to see every one of our issues would be 100 pages. It would be full color because there was
Oh
so
yeah.
much to cover. There were so many interesting new movies to get into. And even though, back then also a lot of them were getting very limited theatrical or straight to video release, it was with much more prominence, I think, than back in the 90s when horror almost went underground in a sense. You had a
Mm.
handful of really major movies that came out and made an impact, but in the 2000s, that's when you started to see things really kind of pick back up.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I'm so fascinated by that. The pre-digital era where there were like literal all full color, you know what I mean? Like, cause they weren't always all full color, you know what I mean? Like you had to do, because it cost more. And the distribution platform, to release a magazine, it had to have been just such a hard piece of work to like guarantee, because also this is the time where you're like calling somebody or sending a letter or getting an order and then just shipping it out and assuming it gets there. There's no like digital tracking confirmation and an email trail to like pull everything together. I mean I think all magazines and all paper distribution of that time it's sort of a lost art form that I don't think will ever probably come back because the digital is just taking it over.
Yeah, well, I wasn't privy to the whole distribution to that side of the magazine. I was just focused on the content.
Just the content. Well, you're more in like I take these weird tangents of like I'm really excited about like stuff like that. Like, oh, supply chain, but that's so weird. This goes to a guy on a boat, to a guy on a train.
Yeah, we had really good distribution. Fango was getting into Barnes and Noble and all the major bookstores and everything. So
Oh yeah.
and the name it had a lot of cachet, and I think it still does. Fangoria is still going. We're still coming out every few months. I guess it's a quarterly now. And
Yeah.
we have gotten back into Barnes and Noble. The magazine is in the stores again, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, if we're talking about little tangents here, I have to say I remember I'd be at the bookstore with my brother and my mom, and my brother would pick up a Sports Illustrated and I would pick up a Fangoria, and I knew my mom would say no, so I would hide it underneath my brother's Sports Illustrated, and I'd carry it for him, and I'd be like, I got it. And then we'd go up to the cash register, and I'd turn them over so you could just see that. So they would just like, my mom couldn't see the thing, and she's like too busy with her books or whatever. And I just remember that'd be the only way I could get out of the bookstore. And then I do want to pivot too, because you've been talking about that, is Rue Morgue.
Yeah.
And then you started, I think, 97 with them?
96. Yeah, that was
96.
after I got let go from Fangoria when it was in all kinds of trouble, which I won't get into. But it was going through a very bad time. And so I got let go. And then Rue Morgue almost immediately called me up and offered me a place on their writing staff, which was wonderful of them. And so now, both outlets are really cool with me writing for both publications. And I found a way to kind of divide my efforts between the two of them. So that's really been great. And I've been able to write some cool stuff. Like I got to do the cover story on the new Halloween. I got to go on the set, and we did a big Jamie Lee Curtis interview for that. And last year they actually, I wrote about a movie called The Harbinger, which I think is one of those great little independent horror films that didn't get nearly the attention it deserved. and Rue Morgue put it on the cover, which I thought was awesome. Because that movie really deserved the attention, I think, and it was really nice that they gave it that showcase and put it on the cover of the magazine.
So,
Oh yeah.
Mike, how would you describe? And again, I'm kind of focusing just on horror because that's kind of, I think, the niche, that I'd really like to explore here. From your experience starting in the late 80s to now in the early to mid 2020s, what is the biggest change you've seen in the horror industry?
Wow. Well, I think it's interesting because I think we're now kind of coming back to where we were in the 80s when there was a large variety of horror films being made. I mean, I said before about how the 80s were defined by slasher movies, but that's kind of how one group of people looked at it. But really, when you look at the 80s, there were all kinds of horror movies being made. There were werewolf movies and ghost stories and, alien monster, the children of Alien basically were coming out. And, I think now we're back to the same place where all different kinds of horror movies are being made, and it's not defined by just one type of film. I know, some people think that all the horror these days is, what some people call the A24 or the word I hate, which is elevated horror, which is a term I despise because it suggests that horror's default system is trash, which it isn't. Horror doesn't have to be elevated from anything. Thank you very much. But there really is all different kinds of stuff coming out. You also have, you have hardcore gore stuff like Terrifier 2, which came out and somehow made $10 million on a tiny regional release, which was pretty great to see that something that extreme could still make that kind of money. So, I think and again, we're back to the point where you had movies in theaters and coming straight to video. And now you have movies that hit theaters and go straight to streaming. And we've kind of cycled back to that period in the 80s where you were getting a lot of variety and the movies were being delivered in different ways. And there are the people today who think that horror isn't as great as it was in the 80s. And it's like, I grew up in the 80s. A lot of those 80s movies are not great.
What are you talking about? Get the hell out of here.
There are a lot of classics, but let's face it, there was a lot of formulaic kind of crap coming out back then too. I find it really interesting that some people seem to look at 80s stuff through this haze of nostalgia, and most of them, as far as I can tell, were not even around back in the 80s. So they're kind of having a nostalgia for something they came to after it had been a thing. So look, I love a lot of the 80s stuff, but I also think a lot of the 80s stuff is not very good. I love a lot of the current stuff, and there's also a lot of current stuff that's not very good. I think you get the good and the bad at every period in horror's history, including the last few decades.
Yeah, on that note, so you cover a ton of shit. Like, I think that's fair to say, right? Like, you watch most of the bigs, if not all of them. I'd say probably fair to say you watch a huge portion of those smaller, kind of like more mid-range films that you want. What, for you, what does a film do that steps aside from the crowd for you?
Well, the first obvious thing is it has to be scary. If I see something that really scares me or unnerves me, and movies still can even after all these years, that's obviously the first thing. And then it's just, does it take an interesting approach, or does it do something different, or does it take kind of a trope and do something interesting with it, or does it kind of adapt to the current times? For example, The Harbinger, which I just mentioned, is one of the many films that kind of dealt with the pandemic and what we were going through during the whole COVID era. And, there were some very cheesy ones that came out, the whole COVID zombies type of thing. But this one really talks about what it was like to be isolated, and the terror in this movie, not to give away too much, but it ties in with the sense of isolation and the sense that we were separated and we were kind of losing our social connectivity. And it dealt with that through a horror lens that I thought was really interesting. And, just anything that I think can bring a different spin or a creative spin, or just something that's even something that takes a traditional subject but does it well with good writing and good acting. And one of the nice things is that, back in the 80s, you had to have a certain amount of money to make a feature film because it had to be done on 35 millimeter. And nowadays the tools are so easy to get a hold of that people, creative people can go out and make a movie very inexpensively and give it kind of a production polish, so it doesn't have that kind of cheap look that we associate with the shot on video movies from past decades. That said, now anyone can go out and make a movie. And so now there are lots and lots of movies that look good, but don't really do anything new with the material. So, the new availability of the technology is kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's just like exchanging one type of creativity for the other, but you need both. You need
Yeah.
it.
And then
And
there's the kind of trend of, there are certain movies now that can come out because they have a really kind of clickbait friendly idea. Like that Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey is a
Yeah.
good.
I could not believe that was real. When I saw the trailer, I was like, this has to be a fucking joke. Like, this cannot be a real movie. And then it is. I've not seen it yet. I am definitely going to watch it, but now,
That's the thing. It's like it comes out, it gets all this attention because it's like, oh, it's this outrageous idea and it's so wacky. And then I saw the movie. It's terrible. I mean,
that's great.
It is not well made. It is not well acted. It does nothing with the idea of being a Winnie the Pooh horror film. It just like takes the names, and then you have a couple of beefy guys in overalls and animal masks running around killing girls. And but because it has that hook that's a good bit of clickbait, it got so much more attention than The Harbinger or another really kind of sci-fi drama called The Artifice Girl that came out around the same time.
That's super interesting.
Really provocative. So I think there's a sense where internet culture can give attention to the wrong films every so often.
Sure, of course. I mean, but that's the same. I mean, that really is just marketing culture, right? Like, I'd say that's really strong marketing for a really shitty film. And that, I think that happens. I get so, I think there's this trend happening right now with trailers where trailers show everything in the movie. Everything. Yep. They tell you every big trick they have. They show you every single story point. There is literally no intrigue, mystery, or whatever. They show you every fact, and then you go in and you watch it. And I just find that so exhausting and sort of, I mean, not trying to be, academic here, but trite. I mean, the whole point is to like hook me and leave me wanting more for trailers. Is like, and when you see everything, I find it just harder to really want to watch the film. I was like, you already showed me every trick you got.
Yeah, no, and that's nothing new. I mean, I remember, back in the 80s, if you look back in the trailers, they showed everything there also. I mean, if you look at the trailer for The Howling, they show you the end of the movie in the trailer.
Yeah.
But you have to sell the sizzle too. I remember if you've ever seen The Gate, there's that great shot where you have the workman, he falls down on the floor and his body breaks apart and turns into all the little monsters. That's easily the best scene in the movie. And they put that in the trailer and everyone goes like, whoa, that's awesome. I've got to see this movie. So even though they've given away the best gag in the film, it's also helped get people into the theater, and that movie became kind of a sleeper hit. So,
but I would say that element creates a question of like, how did this happen and what happens next? You know what I mean? Right. So whereas a lot of these are like, this is it. This person turns into this thing follows them, it comes in, it kills them, and then they win in the end. It's like, well, I mean, no shit. Like, we know that that's generally what's going to happen in a movie, but come on, man. Like, it's just 3 minutes.
But then we've got there's go ahead.
There's definitely an art to doing a trailer where you show people enough to get them hooked, but not so much that I mean, I think Barbarian is a great example of subverting that. You see that trailer and you're like, you think you've seen the whole thing, but it's enough to hook you into it, and then you go and you're like, that's not everything at all. That's
exactly the one I was thinking about.
And that's such a great bit of marketing there. I think I wish more horror films, because if you have a horror film where you don't have enough in your first half hour to fill a good trailer, you've done something wrong, I think.
So I would also say like that's intriguing, like, because sorry, I was just really focused on what you just said, and I was like, oh, that's a really smart thing to say, and it kind of derailed my thought there.
Sorry.
No. I mean, just say more brilliant shit, Mike. All right, you're on the spot. Go. No, no, I like the 100%. I think that, I mean, Barbarian is I remember what I was going to say. You know what's weird about films is, and you don't really know this when you're setting out to make a film, but the trailer and the marketing aspect of the film, oftentimes the filmmakers have literally nothing to do with, like almost nothing. It is a lot to do with your distributor, your salespeople. They create that material and they're very sort of precious about it, which was a really interesting sort of experience, because you can make a product and then somebody can completely market it in a direction you don't think applicable, and there's really not a lot to do about it, and so much of the life hinges on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are cases, from the 70s and 80s on down to today where they'll take a movie that is not necessarily horror and sell it hard as a horror film, or vice versa, where they'll market it as something it's not, just to get the audience in. The problem these days, which you did not have back in the 70s and 80s, is you have the internet, which gives you instant word of mouth.
Mm.
Where if you sell a movie one way and then on Friday night people see that it's not what you're selling, by Saturday morning everybody knows about it. And that's not something you had in the 80s, but it is a factor today, and it is something that I think people have to kind of think about, because if you're misleading people, people will know it and they'll let other people know it right away.
Yeah, well, and that makes me think, especially with the instant gratification and the spread, word of mouth being spread instantly. I remember, it's a little adjacent to an earlier question. Was it 10, 15 years ago? You were talking at the New York Horror Film Festival, talking about the state of horror, and you mentioned it. I think one of my films that we love, which is Monsters.
Yeah.
But it was I think it's an open-ended question, but I would say, what would you say, based on that difference, what is the state of horror now?
I think it's in a very healthy state. Even though some of the best movies aren't getting the release they should, they're still getting out there and getting made. And I think one of the great things about festivals, and my personal favorite is Fantasia, but then there's Fantastic Fest, and overseas you have Sitges and so many others, is that there are places for these movies to get seen, places that they can get reviewed, where the word can spread online, etc. And if you've done a good movie, it will get noticed, I think. And if you're really lucky, it'll get picked up by a distributor who will really get it out there, get it seen, and basically help you to get your next movie made. And as much as I have an issue with Rotten Tomatoes on many levels, if you go to their list of the top 100 horror films of the year, or whatever, based on the rankings, you'll see that there's a lot of good stuff out there that's getting noticed by the critics and getting the good reviews. I think the last time I looked, the number one movie was this one called Huesera, which is a Spanish language movie that I saw at Tribeca last year. That's really good. It's a really good slow burn kind of horror film. And movies that maybe even 15 years ago might not have been noticed at all now can get noticed thanks to the internet. So it is that kind of double-edged sword. But in general, horror is a proven commercial genre right now, so people want to do more of it. People are willing to invest in it. Streaming is allowing for series to be, which are very much sometimes more creative than the movies, the feature films are, in terms of the bigger ones. So I think horror is actually in a very healthy place right now.
That's great. Yeah, that's that it's how I feel. So I'm glad to hear that, especially from the way we've kind of talked and constructed things today, and discovered, and as you've laid out, specifically from your really unique and well-researched vantage point. And especially too, I have to just kind of throw out your books that you've published, the Ad Nauseam books.
Oh yeah,
the Ad
thank you.
Astra. Yeah, which are great, and it makes sense with all of your being involved in with such of the visual stuff, and seeing every, just how we quote unquote see it. And so I wanted to just kind of a shout out to your Ad Nauseam, 1 and 2, and was Ad Astra. But
Oh,
and it
thanks.
made, yeah, of course. Well, tell just real quick a little bit about those books, if you want.
Well, they're basically, I started clipping horror movie ads out of newspapers when I was about 12 years old, and I collected them for all those years. And for years, I wanted to put together a book of them, and I finally got to do so thanks to 1984 Publishing and Rue Morgue, which branded the first couple of them. And I think it's interesting, and I especially appreciate that I was able to go from 1980 and then do the 1990s and 2000s in the second volume, because you can really see the way the advertising changed, and also the way the releases changed. Because in the 80s, even the smallest movie could get a release in, say, 50 theaters in the New York area. By the 2000s, these films were treated almost kind of like art films. They'd play in like one or two theaters in the New York area as specialized titles before they went to video. So you can kind of almost trace the way horror films were not just marketed, but also released and consumed in theaters. Looking at the way and the ads became much more subtle as they went along. They were much more kind of in your face and not as suggestive in the 80s. And then they became quite a bit more suggestive as you got into the 2000s.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And I just for our community and listeners here, please, if you haven't already, check them out. They are awesome. So, Mike, a very important question on the heels of that is, what would you consider one of your top favorite classic Pixar films?
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many that I really like. I mean, I think Up is amazing.
Up is amazing. Best cold open to a movie I think ever made.
Oh my God, that just destroyed me. I mean, you want to talk about something with an emotional impact.
And so fast.
Yeah. And I also really like Coco, which I believe that's Pixar, right?
Yeah.
That's not just Disney.
Yeah, no, that's a dark horse. Most people don't really like watch that as much, but it is a great movie.
And it's all about the Day of the Dead and the land where the dead reside. And there's some really kind of heavy stuff in that movie for what people might perceive as, oh, it's a kid's film or a family film. It gets into some and another one of the Disney films that I love for that reason is their version of Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Arguably the most vicious villain in all of Disney movies. I mean, he's right up there.
Well, there's a scene where he's like singing about the temptation of his lust for Esmeralda, and these like demonic monks come out of the walls, and it's like,
yes,
literally you're watching a European horror film with music. I mean, that's basically what it is. That was done, I believe, during a transitional period at the studio where no one was really paying attention to what was going on, and they got some really kind of heavy stuff into what I'm pretty sure was a G-rated film or PG at the most, and it's pretty heavy.
Oh yeah, you're right. It's rated G, which is amazing. 95, 96, and it's rated G.
And Disney's still doing it. I saw Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 recently. I can't believe that even got a PG-13 rating.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm so excited to see it. I've been waiting to take my wife.
But I wouldn't be surprised if there are a whole lot of traumatized children coming out of that movie.
Those are not children's movies. I will say, look, I mean, I'm not. I don't believe in being prudish about content, and there are certain lines and certain aspects, but those films are not. They're not built for a children's attention span. They're built for an adult.
Well, but they're still promoting it with Happy Meals and stuff. I mean, they're definitely pitching these movies. They're still pitching it towards the 4-quadrant family audience.
Sure, I think that's more like, hey, you have permission to take your children to this because we sold it to them in a Happy Meal, Dad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and then and the other Guardians movies. I mean, they all had some heavy stuff, but not too bad. This one, boy, James Gunn really just it almost felt like. I mean, this was not obviously the history, but that felt like Disney had just let him go, and he's like, all right, before I go, look, I'm going to throw all this shit into a movie.
I cannot wait, man. You've made me more excited to see that now.
If you have small children, I would think twice before taking them because it's rough.
And if you'd rather take them to a good PG movie, just take them to Poltergeist, Jaws, or Gremlins.
Well, that's a funny thing. I came of age in an era when, I was a teenager when they invented the PG-13 because, Gremlins and Indiana Jones were considered too rough for the PG. And,
right.
And there are a lot of other horror films from the 70s, like It's Alive was a PG, Tourist Trap was PG. You could get away with, in fact, one of the fun things I discovered when I updated Ad Nauseum to include the 70s, there were horror films that were rated G back at the time that would never get a G rating these days.
Wow.
Like a few of the Hammer films I think they were cut slightly, but even so, they got G ratings or PG. Like the first Blind Dead movie was cut slightly, got a PG back in the day. The ratings board was what's weird is like the 80s were considered the time where they had to cut movies to get an R, but not too far before that you could get away with a whole lot in a PG. It's really weird. And now you can get away, like I can't believe Evil Dead Rise got an R. How they got an R for that? astounds.
Yeah.
That movie, if anything, is bloodier than the original, which had to go out unrated. So it's also been fun to watch the way the ratings have responded to horror, on and off during this entire period from the 70s into the current times.
I think ratings are a whole other podcast in and of their own because they've gone through so many changes and missions and political driven, aspects as well as just downright confusing aspects.
Yeah.
And I should also note, by the way, I think it's great that horror is now so commercial because the first two Evil Dead movies were not box office hits. They were both released regionally. I think they both made less than $10 million each. And now you have Evil Dead Rise, which is every bit as graphic as those two. It's close to $70 million as a major nationwide release. So I think the fact that we can have a super gory Evil Dead movie in theaters making more money than Shazam, I think that's a great thing.
Well, I think that is where we need to wrap it up because, Mike, you have just spoken hope into our gory hearts, which is that horror is finally, bringing people out to the theater with the respect that it deserves and saying, hey, we are absolutely creative. We need no excuses. There's no reason to put a suffix or a prefix on anything that we do. Art is art. Creative is creative. Our stories are strong. And come out and see people get killed. So I love that. And Mike, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, seriously, Mike, it's great to hang out with you, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was great.
Filmmaking is a collaborative experience, as is this podcast. So be sure to follow us on Instagram at framework_productions. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to IFG wherever you get your podcasts. But no matter where you do listen, if you could also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts specifically, that really is one of the best ways to broaden and strengthen our community, as well as just helping us make these episodes better. Speaking of, if there's something you'd like for us to cover on a future episode, we are now on Discord. Just look in the show notes for more. IFG, How Movies Get Made. Hey friends, we just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about two personal things. First, we wanted to thank you, our listening community, and our wonderful guests, learning so much together along the way and continuing to learn, sharing our stories, making a lot of new friends, and collaborating, which is exactly what this is all about. Which also brings me to my second point. In great part to many of these new relationships, we wanted to let you know that we've taken a lot of this advice ourselves and made our own narrative feature film, Herd, H-E-R-D, Herd, which is premiering this October on Friday the 13th in select theaters as well as on VOD. Personally, I think it's the perfect kind of scary movie to watch during our favorite scary season. So we'd love for you to celebrate with us and watch Herd. You can pre-order it on Apple TV, and of course, do the communal thing, see it in theaters. Of course, for all of this, please see our show notes, but basically, we're going to keep it all updated at herd.film. That's HERD.FILM, herd.film as well. Thank you again, and be sure to give us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts so we can continue to build this community and collaborate. IFG, How Movies Get Made.